The subject matters that I had wanted to discuss today, one revolves around I noticed that appeared in Paul Craig Roberts, and I happened to hear part of the broadcast. And the other goes back to something that Dan had wanted me to take a look at. What Dan had wanted me to take a look at was a report by a very conscientious individual suggesting several different ways of dealing with the problem that the West is under the control of a ruling elite. And Dan, is he a reporter or a commentator or a journalist? I didn't check that out.
He was actually in the State Department at one point, and actually, as I recall, his last position was in the Office of Management and Budget, and he was under, what's that, Ohio Republican who is very much anti-Trump, Kasich. John Kasich was his boss. And he's written a couple of books since leaving. I find it very thoughtful and thought-provoking.
I would agree. Like a number of people who work in the government, he's entirely too close to the forest. In order to, he sees individual trees, and he's absolutely correct there. The article that Paul Craig Roberts addressed was that he had heard a newscast on National Public Radio to the effect that an author, a novelist, had written a book that included both dialogue and a central character was an African-American male. And since the authoress was female, to her astonishment, she came under attack, I will call it cultural attack, for presuming to write about the point of view of a black man, herself being a white woman. Under which circumstances a whole lot of stuff wouldn't have gotten written in the past. But there are two limbs to my thought process here, and one is that Dan's author is so close to the trees that he cannot see the forest, and Paul Craig Roberts' authoress is the victim of one of the two dimensions of what I will call imperialism, for a lack of a better word. Janet very rightly said that political correctness is tyranny with a smiley face. Well, in the last 50 years, 50 years, Americans have been subjected to a vast variety of forms of tyranny with a smiley face. And I look at two forms of tyranny. One is economic tyranny, and the other is cultural tyranny. And they both stem from a ruling elite. You may say there are two ruling elites. You may say there is one ruling elite with two separately identifiable characteristics. I think I will take the time now to start this because I would like you to be able to read. Or shall I just read them? I've got a couple news. Thank you, Russ. Let me read out loud two things that were said at different times by a member of the Rockefeller family. This quotation is from David Rockefeller. I want you to, actually, maybe I can get that on now. Let's see if I can. David Rockefeller quotation. We are grateful to the Washington Post the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications, and he might have as well added other media outlets, whose directors have attended our meetings and respected the promises which they gave of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. And frankly, the key to what David is saying is in this next sentence. Surely the supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. I seriously doubt that that needs any serious interpretation or translation. World government in the hands of an intellectual elite and world bankers is perceived as being substantially better than government by nation states. I would suggest that that point of view is not shared by a large number of Sri Lankans, French, British, Germans, Chinese, Russians, Japanese, or anyone who is in the lower 90% of the people who own wealth of any sort. The second piece of information, which is 90 years, yes, 90 years earlier, roughly 90 years. This is by John D. Rockefeller, and he is a member of the General Board of Education. And this is what he has to say about the people who are going to be educated under the principles of the General Board of Education, of whose directors he is a member. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present education conventions of intellectual and character education fade from their minds, and unhampered by their own tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive, I might add, illiterate folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers or men of science. We have not to raise up from them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task is simple. We will organize children and teach them in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. This I will interpret a little bit and say that John D. Rockefeller is saying, we will educate them in such a fashion that they do not know that they are being deprived of a vast source of knowledge and understanding that would increase their horizons and make them troublesome citizens. Because if you expand somebody's horizons, he or she will become a questioner of the status quo. One of the small elements I wanted to mention, I don't want to lose this, is that John Rappaport has suggested that the current hysteria over the coronavirus is a smokescreen. It is a smokescreen because the Chinese are very worried about the Chinese citizen becoming upset about the health conditions in Wuhan and other of the major cities in China, because Wuhan has a smog problem that made Los Angeles look like a mountain resort. At 12 times the density of small particles that was at present in Los Angeles, Wuhan and other cities in China have a major pollution problem. They are working on it by importing natural gas from Russia as quickly as they can to convert their electricity generators to natural gas rather than coal. They are investing substantial funds in totally clean energy. The American population has been persuaded that nuclear energy is terrible and wasteful, and in the form of nuclear weapons and the technology that was used to develop the nuclear weapons, that is a correct assessment. There are, however, multiple alternative technologies for developing nuclear energy that are very safe and very clean and very efficient. China is investing in that. GE and Westinghouse decades ago chose not to investigate in that. But the point I wanted to bring out from John Rappaport's report is that the Chinese government, Chinese communists, are afraid of their people. Not afraid in the sense of being frightened by them, but they know they have 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. 1 out of 5 human beings on the face of the earth is Chinese. And they are politically literate. They are knowledgeable. They are not activated in the sense that an American activist would be activated, but they are knowledgeable. The Chinese government has brought more people out of poverty in China in the last decade than exist in the United States. That is to say, they have brought more than 300 million people out of poverty in the last decade. That kind of development causes pollution, and they are working as quickly as they can to control that pollution. One of the reasons they are very sensitive about the Uyghur population in Western China is that the West, in particular the United States, has been, the Uyghur population is largely nowadays Islamic. And the vast majority of the Uyghurs are perfectly content to live as a minority, as one of the 100 recognized minorities in China, but a small percentage of the Islamic Uyghurs have been or are attempting to be recruited by the deep state in the United States. Just as Arab Islamists, Wahhabis, were recruited from Saudi Arabia to go to Afghanistan and create trouble for the Soviet Union, so the United States is attempting to recruit Islamic Uyghurs to create trouble for communist China. Surprise, surprise. But the important point that I'm taking away from this vignette is that the Chinese government is afraid of the Chinese people in the sense that the American government is not at all afraid of the American people. And I will show you why they are not afraid of the American people.
So how does this relate to the virus? Are you saying that they manufactured it?
No, I'm saying, I'm calling attention through the subject of the virus that communist China has a substantial problem with pollution that is subject to political exploitation and that is also being addressed by the government. And Dawn and I had a brief conversation via email. The letter I sent out a few days ago, no, I sent it out yesterday, was the report of a young woman who had worked in Senegal. And she paints a picture of the United States that still exists to some degree, especially in the middle portion of the United States. She couldn't have said the things that she said about Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle now, or for that matter, Newark, New Jersey. But she could have said that about places in Ohio, places in Iowa, places in Illinois, even places in Alabama. Dawn thought it was propagandistic. Since I think the young lady believed what she was saying, I don't see it as propaganda. Perhaps a bit naive, but I don't see it as propaganda. And I was, by sending out the letter, I was intentionally calling attention to the fact that this young lady had encountered a conflict of cultures. And in that conflict of cultures, she realized that trying to bring the West to Senegal was a lost cause. I'll even point out that the person who quoted her essay was Jimmy Moglia, who was writing for the Saker. And he used the young lady's account as an introduction to a letter, to an article that he was writing about what was happening in Italy, which was being forced to take in large numbers of North African and African people. And in the process, they were undergoing cultural assault. Italy was no longer Italy, just as England is no longer England, but the English have a bit of an advantage there because most of the brown and yellow and other white people that are coming to Britain have already been in, quote, the British Empire. So to some extent they've been Britanized. But the young men, especially coming from Tripoli, coming from Senegal, coming from sub-Saharan Africa as well as Saharan Africa, they have not been Europeanized. They are bringing African cultures to Italy, Germany, Sweden, Britain, and France. And it is working, it is absolutely cultural assault. Assault is the tamest word I can think of. I'm trying to think of a more brutal word. Because Swedish women, they're not going out into the streets nowadays. German people, and particularly young German women, are emigrating with their whole families to Hungary, because Hungary has resisted the importation of vast numbers of African peoples. And this has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with cultural stability. So, I want to show you why the ruling elites are not afraid of Americans. Can I get this larger?
And they know a very interesting thing, which blows away all of our thinking. Because we're still locked in the Henry Ford past of 100 years ago. We think that the CEOs of major companies, when they make products, right, that they will pay us a good amount so we can buy the products. They think we, the consumers, are part of something with that. We're not anymore. That's not how they think of it. That's not how they think of it. Because they live in a world where they know that we are quite willing to redistribute massive amounts of wealth upwards. We don't object. We actually let them take immense amounts of money and really kind of alter the whole economic structure. We basically say, well, some of it will trickle down on us. And they know also that they can do global trade deals that literally take away our small d democratic rights to make fundamental decisions about the environment, about work life, about our communities, about almost everything that matters to us. And they know that by and large, even though we don't like it, we will elect people who tell us that they're going to make them better the next time. Yeah, NAFTA didn't work. Okay, China free trade will be better. Yeah, China free trade didn't work. Well, CAFTA will be better. Well, CAFTA didn't work. Well, the TPP will be better, Right? It's always going to be, somehow it's going to work. And they know that somehow they keep doing, these CEOs know that that keeps happening. And this is the thing they know, the biggest thing they know. We, the people, we like to eat. And some of us like to eat more than others, but we generally like to eat. And so they know that when they reduce the number of jobs, when they wipe out whole industries, we will not say, hold it, I object. Because we didn't object when they wiped out whole industries with their trade deals. We didn't object when they massively culled out our workforce. We haven't objected 40 years into stagnant wages. We haven't objected to the change from a situation where one person in a family could work while someone else stayed home with the kids, and while we had enough income to actually do all these things, and our kids could go to college, and instead of having massive debt that would last through the rest of their lives, it was actually something you could pay for with a part-time job. We didn't object to any of those changes. So why would they worry that when they take away massive numbers of jobs? Because they know that we will work harder. We will come earlier and stay later. We'll keep trying to cobble together an existence. I know this is going to sound crazy. They believe that we will take our private cars and troll around the streets of cities trying to pick people up and give them rides for a little bit of money, and will come some crazy German word like Uber or something like that. They believe that will happen. They believe we will get so desperate that we'll take rooms in our homes and rent them out and call it Airbnb. They believe correctly, that even as they cull out stable jobs that have real hours and schedules and benefits and enough pay to support people, they know that we'll just keep trying to cobble something together. And so they don't see this as some sort of bad calculus. They believe that there's a whole bunch more wealth to be redistributed upwards. And they also know something else. The last institutions that will ever talk about this in a serious way are those that make up our media. They know that our media will never, ever say, hold it, we're stopping this ridiculous conversation about Donald Trump's hands, because we can see in the foreseeable future Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, the top experts at Oxford, the people that really do work on this stuff are telling us we are within years of a progressively more jobless economy, and maybe that matters more than Donald Trump's hands. Right? They know the media won't do that. Right? They know the media won't do that.
As a point to make that very same point, when was the last time anyone here saw a movie, or for that matter saw a TV program, in which poverty was a central element? The last one I remember was A Raisin in the Sun, made in the 1950s. Now, let me show you, in all seriousness, what the ruling elite would be genuinely afraid of. Where is it now? There it is. Were it ever to eventuate, this is what the ruling elite would be terrified of.
Eyes and ears have detected movement heading towards Trafalgar Square.
This is Perimeter 1, we have enemy contact.
I want you to notice that these people wearing masks have no weapons.
There's no response from command or from party leader Creedy.
Stand down! Stand down!
The second after that, the clock explodes in a marvelous display of fireworks. That is from the end of the movie V for Vendetta. The mob is not a mob. It is a group of people who understand who the enemy is and who are united in their opposition to that enemy. And the basic reason the elite in the West are not afraid of the American people is they have us fighting homosexual against heterosexual, male against female, black against white. There were two major social movements in the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century, that were not sponsored by the government. That was the anti-war movement in the 60s and early 70s, and the Black Rebellion, exemplified in Martin Luther King in the Pacific expression, and exemplified by the riots in black ghettos as the violent expression. On the other hand, there was a social movement that was promoted by our government. Ms. Magazine was underwritten by the CIA. I don't know if Barbara Steinem took a salary herself, but remember last week we talked about agents of revolt in Ukraine or Syria or Libya, where people who were dissatisfied with the status quo were hired, trained, and used to foment either civil unrest, or in some cases revolution, or in other cases coup d'etat. Does anyone in this room think that the people who are promoting multisexuality or political correctness in any of a host of fashions, this is the reason that the Paul Craig Roberts essay came to mind. It is a well-known fact now that the young lady from Sweden who was talking about how guilty our generation is because of global warming, she is being sponsored, not only by her parents who were profiting, but by the equivalent of the National Endowment for Democracy. The creation of social discontent of A versus B, and B versus C, and X versus Y, it fits into the plan of keeping the population well under control. Because if C is fighting X and Y is fighting B, they're not going to become that unified group challenging the authority of the militarized elites.
You know, one struggle that seems like it's not being promoted is the class struggle. It seems like that issue's been eliminated. Everyone idolizes the rich, like you say. We don't see anything about poor people. So somehow, through education, that whole issue of division between poor people, middle, is eliminated. You don't hear anything about class struggle.
Mr. Nichols, I think, tells you why.
Yeah, yeah.
He tells you that the media will not shine a spotlight where you ought to be looking. That's the reason The Raisin in the Sun was the last movie I can think of. And I challenge anyone to come up with a movie that shines a spotlight on poverty. Now, let me show you an alternative way of dealing with the multitude of social conflicts that exist in China, that existed in Ukraine, and that exist in the United States. Oh, where's my file? There it is. the cowboys and the farmers in this segment from Oklahoma are starting to get into a fist fight. And
Ain't nobody gonna slug out anything. This here's a party. Sing it, Andrew. Dum-diddy-um-dum-dum.
Oh, the farmer and the common should be friends.
Good, but louder. Sing it. Sing it. Sing. Come on now,
One
sing.
man likes to push a plow, the other likes to chase a cow, but that's no reason why they can't be friends.
And when this territory is a state and joins the union just like all the others, the farmer and the common and the merchant must all behave themselves and act like brothers.
I'd like to teach you all a little saying and learn the words by heart the way you should. I don't say I'm no better than anybody else, but I'll be danged if I ain't just as good.
I don't say I'm no better than anybody else, but I'll be danged if I ain't just as good.
the vast majority of these situations where there is not outside agitation, and I'm going to say that the promotion of that Swedish young lady was outside agitation, whether it was by her parents and subsequently by other people, or the young men and women who participated in a gay pride parade in Zurich, Switzerland, who made a mockery of everything that Western civilization tends to stand for. My youngest son was bisexual, so I will use him as an example, and he had nothing but contempt for the people who were attempting to politicize the homosexual's desire for some kind of equality and recognition. The last thing he would ever have done is participated in the kind of gay pride parade that is an offense to everything for which Western civilization might reasonably stand. So there is a difference between political equality and the right to rub your behavior in somebody else's nose, regardless of what that behavior is. So, I want to call your attention next to the enormity of the problem. And I've already pointed out that there are at least two dimensions of the kind of assault to which the West is being subjected. That is the cultural one and the economic one. Let me find this. I kind of like this because it's a reasonably good film as well. The person who's going to be speaking, Donald Sutherland, is providing in the role of Fletcher Prouty. Fletcher Prouty was in the military and very important in certain aspects of the deep state. Come on now, there we go.
Is that the JFK movie?
That's the Oliver Stone's JFK. So Fletcher Prouty is talking to the district attorney who's trying to investigate the Kennedy assassination. Oh no, let's see, okay, I thought I had goofed it up.
Garrison?
Yeah?
Glad you came. Sorry about the could give you a false name, but I won't. Just call me X.
I've already been warned by the agency, Mr. Pueblo, so this is another type of threat.
I'm not with the agency, Mr. Garrison. And I assume if you've come this far, what I have to say interests you. But I'm not going to name names and tell you who or what I represent, except to say you're close. Closer than you think. Okay? Everything I'm going to tell you is classified top secret. I was a soldier, Mr. Garrison. 2 wars. I was one of those secret guys in the Pentagon that supplies the military hardware, planes, bullets, rifles, for what we call black operations. Black ops. Assassinations, coup d'etat, rigging elections, propaganda, psych warfare, and so on. World War II, I was in Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia. I helped evacuate part of the Nazi intelligence apparatus just before the end of the war. We used those guys in fighting the communists. In Italy, 48, we stole the elections. France, 49, broke the strikes. Overthrew Korea and the Philippines, Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran. We were in Vietnam in 54, Indonesia 58, Tibet 59, got the Dalai Lama out. We were good. Very good. Then we get into the Cuban thing. Not so good. Set up all the bases for the invasion, supposed to take place in October 62. Khrushchev sent the missiles to resist the invasion. Kennedy didn't invade. And we were standing out there with our dicks in the wind. A lot of pissed off people, Mr. Garrison. You understand? I'll come to that later. So, 1963. I spent much of September 63 working on the Kennedy plan for getting all U.S. personnel out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. This plan was one of the strongest, most important papers issued from the Kennedy White House. His National Security Action Memo 263 ordered home the first 1,000 troops for Christmas. But then in November, 1 week after the murder of Vietnamese President Diego Saigon, and 2 weeks before the assassination of our president, a strange thing happened to me.
1947. The point is the veterans need to be where the troops are. And that's
I got a note saying you want to see the gentleman.
I do indeed. You are going to the South Pole.
I am?
You are. Dr. Mooney's got all the details. I want you to check with him. Have yourself a nice vacation.
I was sent by my superior officer, we'll call him Y. I was sent by General Y to the South Pole for military escort for a group of international VIPs. I was on my way back in New Zealand. The president was killed. Now, Osmond was charged at 7 p.m. Dallas time with Tippett's murder. That's 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the next day, New Zealand time. But already, their papers had the entire history of this unknown 24-year-old man, Oswald. Studio picture, detailed biographical data, Russian information, and we're pretty sure of the fact that he killed the president alone, although it took them 4 more hours before they even charged him with that crime in Dallas. It felt to me as if a cover story was being put up, like we would in a Black Hawk. Anyway, after I came back, I asked myself, why was I, the chief of special ops, selected to travel to the South Pole at that time to do a job that any number of others could have done? And I wondered if it could have been because one of my routine duties, if I had been in Washington, would have been to arrange for additional security in Texas. So I decided to check it out. And sure enough, I found out that someone had told the 112th Military Intelligence Group at 4th Army Headquarters at Fort Sam Houston to stand down that day over the protests of the unit commander, Colonel Reich.
I believe it's a mistake.
This is significant because it is standard operating procedure, especially in a known hostile city like Dallas, to supplement the Secret Service. I mean, even if we had not allowed the bubble top to be removed from the limousine, we would have placed at least 100 to 200 agents on the sidewalk without question. I mean, only a month before in Dallas, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was spit on and hit. There had already been several attempts on de Gaulle's life in France. We would have arrived days ahead of time, studied the route, checked all the buildings, never would have allowed all those wide open empty windows overlooking Dealey, never. We'd have had our own snipers covering the area. The minute a window went up, they'd have been on the radio. We'd have been watching the crowd, packages, rolled up newspapers, coat over and up. Never would have let a man open an umbrella along the way. Never would have allowed that limousine to slow down to 10 miles an hour, much less take that unusual curve at Houston and Elm. You would have felt an army presence in the streets that day. None of this happened. It was a violation of the most basic protection codes we have, and it is the best indication of a massive plot in Dallas. Now, who could have best done this? Black Ops, Mr. Garrison. People in my business, people like my superior officer could have called Colonel Reich and said, look, we have another unit coming from so-and-so providing security. You'll stand down. I mean, that day, in fact, there were some individual Army intelligence people in Dallas. I'm still trying to figure out who and why. But they weren't protecting the client. And, of course, Oswald. Army Intel had a Harvey Lee Oswald on file. But all those files have been destroyed. Many strange things were happening, and your Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with them. We had the entire cabinet on a trip to the Far East. We had 1/3 of a combat division returning from Germany in the air above the United States at the time of the shooting. At 12:34 p.m., the entire telephone system went out in Washington for a solid hour. And on the plane back to Washington, word was radioed from the White House Situations Room to Lyndon Johnson that one individual performed the assassination. Does that sound like a bunch of coincidences to you, Mr. Garrison? No. Not for one moment. The cabinet was out of the country to get their perceptions out of the way. Troops were in the air for possible riot control. The telephones didn't work to keep the wrong stories from spreading if anything went wrong with the plan. Nothing was left to chance. He could not be allowed to escape alive. Well, I never thought things were the same after that. Vietnam started for real. There was an air of, I don't know, make-believe in the Pentagon and CIA. Those of us who'd been in secret ops since the beginning knew the Warren Commission was fiction. But there was something deeper, uglier. I knew Alan Dulles very well. I'd briefed him many a time in his house. But for the life of me, I still can't figure out why he was appointed to investigate Kennedy's death, the man who had fired him. Dulles, by the way, was General Wyeth's benefactor. I got out in '64, resigned my commission.
I never realized Kennedy was so dangerous to the establishment. Is that why?
Well, that's a real question, isn't it? Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who?
I'd encourage you to see that.
What movie is that?
That's
It's JFK.
Oliver Stone's JFK.
Now, they criticized this movie because of that character. At the time of the movie, they said he came up with this fictional Donald Sutherland character, so you're
Stone
saying
was
it's
not
a
at
real...
liberty.
Okay.
We now know
No.
the identity of Mr. X,
Okay.
which was not known, and the Stone, neither Stone nor the district attorney, was at liberty to reveal the identity at that point in time.
And his name is, you mentioned it.
J. Fletcher Prouty.
Okay.
He's got at least one book out. He's given a number of interviews. He's an absolute wealth of information. It's a little surprising that he is still alive, but the major reason I'm using this as an example, I wanted to talk about the enormity of the problem. I want you to be aware that the assassination of John F. Kennedy didn't even require clearance from the ruling elites. I want you to process that for a moment. The people who are in charge of Western political, economic movements and control were in all probability not even consulted over the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The reason being that in terms of the movement of power and the movement of money was totally unaffected. John F. Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam, and that would have interfered a great deal with the movement of monies. Later on in the film, it's Fletcher's person reveals that 3,000 helicopters were lost in Vietnam. Compute the total, cost per individual helicopter, and you're talking about huge sums of money. Harry Truman put the United States on a military basis at the end of World War II, and we have never gotten off of it. The so-called peace dividend that you were going to have in the 1990s was lost due to, quote, terrorism. Now, it's worth adding, there is other information that I'll be delighted to share with you probably on another occasion, but it's worth adding that the so-called terrorist attack of 9/11/2001 very definitely needed to be cleared by the ruling elite, because the sums of money that were being moved back and forth, that were being laundered when the computers were taken over by remote control on 9/11, put the cost of the Vietnam War to shame. It is now known, now I'm not saying that those sums of money were included, but it is now known that there is roughly $24 trillion of Pentagon expenditures that cannot be accounted for. The Pentagon has spent it, the Federal Reserve created the money, and we don't know where it went. Add that to roughly the same amount that the Federal Reserve created in order to save the Western world from economic collapse in 2008, you have a financial coup d'etat and scheme that literally boggles the imagination of people who have pretty good imaginations. Dan's article brought me face to face with the enormity of the problem, which kind of reminded me of a group of people that I've had some disdain for in the past. The group of people being the White Rose Society, who tried to raise some kind of awareness in Germany in 1943. They were scattering leaflets around a particular university in a clandestine fashion, trying to get the students to rise up in rebellion against the Nazi regime. They were amateurs, they were naive, they were caught, they were executed. But there is a time to fight for the lost cause. And the situation that we whose eyes are open face, I tend to get on a pulpit, and people who know me well, they raise their hand when they hear Paul getting on his pulpit. But there are things that we can do that I don't want to even begin to approach now. But I will encourage you, those of you who take vaccinations seriously, get in line and make as much noise as you can. If anyone has a way of attacking ALEC, someone help me on the meaning of that, Graham, but it's basically a foundation or a group of people working with legislators and with lobbyists to get the lobbyists to write the bills for the legislators to get passed. ALEC is active in every state of the union as well as at the national level. It is one of the more perverse ways of getting money into the system. Money is if not the, certainly a major factor. In the Kennedy assassination, power as well as money was involved, because the CIA was about to be decapitated. You'll see that later in the Oliver Stone movie, and that didn't get brought into action because of Kennedy's assassination. So there were people who were at risk of losing vast amounts of power. But people who are at risk of losing vast amounts of power and people who are at risk of losing vast amounts of money will use both the power and the money to hold on to that. But Caitlin Johnstone wrote an article recently I did not quote from it, but I call your attention to it. The ruling elites aren't afraid of Trump, and they're not afraid of Sanders. They're afraid of us. But only if we wake up and only if we get unified. That's as much as I want to say today, Dawn.
You're not gonna...